Your dehumidifier has been running since May. It's July now, and it still hasn't finished. That's not a broken machine, and it's not a room with more moisture in it than your neighbor's. It's a machine solving the wrong problem, and it's been doing that for 3 months straight, while quietly running up your power bill, one full cycle after another, never actually finishing because the thing it's fighting was never really centered in the room it's sitting in. For 6 weeks every summer, most of Japan sits under a weather pattern called tsuyu, the plum rain season, where humidity holds in the 80s and 90s for weeks at a time, with barely a dry day in between. Then the rain stops and summer proper arrives, and it's hotter, with almost no drop in humidity at all. Traditional Japanese homes, built from wood, paper, and woven straw, with no vapor barrier, no air conditioning, and nothing resembling a modern dehumidifier, have survived that climate for centuries. Some of the buildings still standing are 300 or 400 years old. That's not an accident. And it's not because humidity somehow bothered them less. It's because the actual approach to humidity that developed in that climate solves a different problem than the one your dehumidifier is set up to fight. And once you understand what that different problem actually is, the entire way you think about a damp house changes. Before we continue, let me mention one thing. Many of the Japanese methods I share in these videos have been collected into a practical guide over at the Japanese Home Manual. If you'd like to explore them in more detail, you'll find it there. That's all. Now, let's get back to today's method. Here's the part almost nobody explains when they sell you a dehumidifier. The machine treats the entire volume of air in a room, continuously, in order to solve a problem that usually isn't spread evenly through that room at all. Mold doesn't grow because a whole room is damp. It grows in specific spots. The inside of a closet, a corner where airflow never reaches, the back of a cabinet pressed against an exterior wall, where humid air gets trapped and stays trapped, whether or not the rest of the room is being aggressively dried out by a machine running in the middle of the floor. A dehumidifier can run all summer, faithfully lowering the humidity reading on its own display, while the actual problem spot never really improves, because the air in that stagnant pocket barely exchanges with the air the machine is treating in the first place. The second thing almost nobody explains is where all that moisture is actually coming from, and the answer is usually closer to home than people expect. An average household generates a genuinely large amount of water vapor every single day, just through ordinary living. Breathing and perspiration alone add up to 1 liter or more per person. Cooking adds another 2 to 3 liters. Showers and baths another 1 to 2. And then there's the one source that dwarfs everything else on that list: drying laundry indoors. A single load of wet washing, hung to dry inside a closed room, can release somewhere between 2 and 5 liters of water directly into your home's air as it dries. If you're running a load or two indoors every week without direct ventilation, that habit alone can outweigh every other moisture source in the house combined, which means a meaningful share of what your dehumidifier is fighting all summer is water you generated yourself, the night before, in a room with the door shut. So here's the real shape of the problem, and it's worth stating plainly before we get into the actual fix. You have 2 separate issues stacked on top of each other: moisture you're generating yourself faster than it can leave the building, and specific pockets, closets, cabinets, corners, where humid air gets trapped and stays trapped regardless of how hard a machine in the middle of the room is working. A dehumidifier addresses neither of those causes directly. It just fights the symptom, continuously, for as long as you're willing to pay to run it, which is why it never actually finishes the job. The traditional Japanese approach to tsuyu season solves both halves of this problem, and almost all of it costs nothing at all. It comes down to 4 layers: cutting the moisture you generate yourself, moving air deliberately rather than hoping it circulates on its own, using materials that naturally buffer humidity swings, and placing something genuinely absorbent in the specific enclosed pockets where trapped air actually causes problems. The first 3 layers are free. They're habits and small adjustments to how you already live in the space. The 4th layer is where the $9 comes in, and it's worth being honest about exactly what that $9 does and doesn't accomplish. Because overselling a single cheap item is exactly the kind of dishonesty this channel doesn't do. Over the rest of this video, we're going to walk through all 4 layers in the order that actually matters, starting with the free changes that do most of the real work, and finishing with the one small, inexpensive item that handles the specific problem those free changes can't reach on their own. It's worth understanding why this climate specifically produced this exact solution, rather than treating it as a random cultural quirk. Japan combines 2 things that rarely show up together at this intensity: genuinely extreme humidity for weeks on end, and, historically, almost none of the mechanical tools we now take for granted to fight it. No refrigerant-based dehumidifiers, no central air conditioning, no vapor barrier house wrap. A country facing that climate, with those constraints, either developed a real, working answer to moisture, or it lost its buildings to rot and mold within a generation. The buildings that survived 4 centuries did so because the answer that emerged actually worked. Not as folklore, but as a genuinely effective response to the same physics governing humidity in your house right now, regardless of what country you live in or how many degrees hotter or cooler your climate runs. That's also why this approach translates so directly to a modern home, even one with central air and sealed windows. The physics of water vapor, absorption, and airflow haven't changed since the Edo period. What's changed is that a lot of modern building practice, airtight construction, vapor-sealed paint, sealed-up closets, accidentally recreates the exact stagnant, trapped air conditions that traditional Japanese design spent centuries specifically engineering around. Modern homes didn't get worse at handling humidity because the physics changed. They got worse because a lot of what makes a house energy efficient also makes it harder for trapped moisture to find its own way out, unless you deliberately give it one. That's the entire premise of everything that follows in this video. Not fighting your house's efficiency, but working with it deliberately instead of accidentally undermining it. Let's start with layer 1, the free changes to how much moisture you're actually generating, since it's the biggest lever most households have never touched. Layer 1 is simple, and it costs nothing at all. Stop putting more water into the air than you have to, and give the water you do generate a direct path outside, rather than letting it circulate through the rest of the house. This layer alone, done consistently for a week, is usually enough for households to notice a real difference in how sticky the air feels, well before any of the later layers even come into play. Laundry is the single biggest target here, since a load or 2 dried indoors can outweigh every other moisture source in your home combined, as we covered in part 1. If you have to dry laundry indoors, do it in one room with the door closed and the window open, so that water leaves through that window rather than touring the rest of the house looking for a cold or stagnant spot to settle in. If you have a tumble dryer, confirm it's actually vented to the outside rather than venting into the room, which is a surprisingly common oversight in older installations. An unducted dryer empties every load's worth of water straight into your home's air, working directly against anything else you're doing to control humidity. Cooking is the second target. A pot at a rolling boil with no lid is functionally a humidifier running in your kitchen, and something as simple as keeping lids on pans while cooking meaningfully cuts how much steam escapes into the room. Bathrooms are the third. Run the exhaust fan during a shower and for a genuine 20 minutes afterward, not just while the water's running, since the moisture stays suspended in the air well after you've stepped out and toweled off. None of this is expensive or complicated. It's simply directing water vapor toward an exit at the moment it's created, rather than letting it disperse through the house and become someone else's problem an hour later. Layer 2 is deliberate airflow, and this is where the instinct most people have is actually backwards. The common move in a damp house is leaving a window cracked open all day, on the theory that a little airflow all the time beats none at all. In humid weather specifically, that's often the wrong approach, and it's worth understanding exactly why. A window left slightly open for hours exchanges air slowly, which sounds fine, but it also means humid outside air is continuously entering and mixing with your indoor air for that entire stretch, rather than being flushed through in one decisive pass. What actually works better, and what traditional Japanese design was built around under the concept of kaze no michi, the wind's path, deliberately placing openings so air enters on one side of a structure and exits on the other, moving straight through rather than lingering, is short, complete exchanges rather than a slow trickle. Open windows fully on two opposite sides of a room for 5 to 10 minutes, ideally during the part of the day when outdoor humidity briefly dips, often early morning before the heat builds, rather than midday when outdoor air may be just as humid as what's already inside. A full, brief exchange moves the entire volume of air in that room out and replaces it, taking its moisture load with it, in a fraction of the time a slow trickle through a cracked window ever would. Layer 3 is using materials that naturally buffer humidity, rather than fighting it purely with airflow and machines. This is where traditional Japanese interiors did something genuinely clever, worth understanding, even if you're not about to retile your house in tatami. Tatami mats, woven from dried rice straw and rush, are hygroscopic. They absorb water vapor out of the air when humidity spikes and release it back when the air dries out again, acting as a passive buffer that smooths out humidity peaks rather than letting them land directly on a cold or stagnant surface. Traditional wall finishes work the same way. Clay plaster and lime-based finishes both breathe, absorbing and releasing moisture rather than sealing it in or out. Modern acrylic paint, by contrast, is essentially a vapor barrier. It doesn't absorb anything, and it doesn't let the wall behind it release moisture either, which means any water vapor that does reach that surface has nowhere to go and simply sits there as a film of liquid, exactly the condition mold needs to establish itself. You don't need to renovate your house in traditional materials to borrow this principle, though it's worth knowing if you're ever choosing a wall finish for a genuinely problem-prone room. A breathable, mineral-based paint or lime wash, rather than a standard acrylic, meaningfully changes how that wall handles humidity over time. For most households, the more practical version of this same idea is simpler. Avoid trapping fabric, paper, or other absorbent materials in sealed, unventilated spaces for long stretches, since those materials will happily absorb ambient moisture and hold onto it in exactly the stagnant conditions mold prefers, without ever getting the chance to release it back out the way a properly ventilated material would. That connects directly to a specific seasonal habit worth adopting even in a modern home: airing out enclosed storage periodically rather than leaving it sealed indefinitely. In Japan, this shows up as mushiboshi, a summer practice of taking clothing, bedding, books, and other stored belongings out into dry, sunny air for a few hours on a clear day, specifically to let anything that's been absorbing moisture in an enclosed space release it back out before it becomes a mold problem. Futons go over a balcony railing. Closet contents get pulled out and aired. Nothing that lives in a sealed space stays sealed in indefinitely. The modern equivalent costs nothing beyond an afternoon. On the next genuinely dry, sunny day, open your closets and cabinets fully for a few hours. And if you have items that have been sitting untouched in an enclosed space for months, take them out into the air rather than leaving them to quietly accumulate whatever moisture that space has been holding. That's 3 full layers. And notice that none of them have cost a single dollar so far. Cutting moisture at the source, moving air deliberately rather than passively, and choosing or working with materials that buffer rather than trap. Together, these 3 layers handle the vast majority of what actually causes a damp house to feel damp. And for a lot of households, doing all 3 consistently meaningfully reduces how hard any dehumidifier running alongside them actually has to work. But there's one specific problem these 3 layers can't fully solve on their own. And it's exactly the problem the $90 dehumidifier was never actually built to reach either. Small, enclosed, stagnant pockets of air where humidity gets trapped regardless of how well the rest of the house is ventilated. That's where the 4th layer, and today's actual $9, comes in. Let's finish with layer 4, the one small item this whole video is actually named after, and the honest limits of what it can and can't do. The specific problem the first 3 layers can't fully solve is trapped, stagnant air in small enclosed spaces. The inside of a closet, a shoe cabinet, the cupboard under a bathroom sink, the back of a dresser drawer. These spaces don't get the benefit of your deliberate window opening routine, since air inside a closed cabinet doesn't meaningfully exchange with the room air just because you aired out the room itself. Left alone through a humid summer, these pockets become exactly the stagnant, moisture-trapped environment mold prefers, regardless of how well ventilated the rest of the house is. This is where charcoal comes in, and it's a genuinely old, well-documented technique rather than a trendy internet hack. In traditional Japanese construction, and specifically in Kura, the fireproof storehouses historically used to protect valuable goods. Charcoal was laid beneath the floor in real quantity, not for heat, but specifically as a passive moisture buffer. The reason it works comes down to structure rather than magic. Hardwood charcoal is riddled with microscopic pores, and the internal surface area packed into a single kilogram of it can run into the hundreds of square meters. That enormous internal surface area absorbs water vapor out of humid air, holds onto it, and releases it back out once the surrounding air dries. The same hygroscopic buffering principle behind tatami and clay plaster, just concentrated into something small enough to sit inside a drawer or a cabinet. A bag of hardwood lump charcoal, or binchotan, Japanese white charcoal specifically prized for this purpose, or bamboo charcoal, typically runs somewhere around $9 to $15 for a bag substantial enough to split across a couple of enclosed spaces in your home. Put a few hundred grams in a breathable cloth bag, or simply in an open dish, and place it inside the specific enclosed space you're trying to protect. A closet, a cabinet, a shoe rack, a drawer that's been holding on to a musty smell no matter how many times you've cleaned it. It will quietly absorb moisture from that enclosed volume of air, and as a genuine bonus, it absorbs odor through the same mechanism, which is why it's also sold in Japan as a natural deodorizer for exactly these kinds of enclosed spaces. The part that makes this a genuinely good $9 purchase rather than a one-time consumable is that the charcoal doesn't wear out or need replacing every few months, the way a disposable moisture-absorbing crystal tub does. Once it's saturated, set it outside in direct sunlight for a day. The heat drives the absorbed moisture back out, and the charcoal is ready to go right back to work. The same bag can keep doing this job for years, which is the real reason it's worth the $9. It's not a subscription the way a running dehumidifier is. It's a one-time purchase that gets reactivated for free, indefinitely, with nothing more than an afternoon of sunlight. Now, the honest limits, because a $9 bag of charcoal deserves the same scrutiny every other claim on this channel gets. Charcoal is a buffer for small, enclosed volumes of air. It will genuinely keep a closet or a cabinet dry and odor-free. It will not dehumidify an entire living room. And if a product listing or another video tells you a bag of charcoal replaces a whole house dehumidifier, that's exactly the kind of overselling this channel refuses to do. The scale simply doesn't work that way. The surface area that makes charcoal effective in a sealed drawer is completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of air in an open room. The same mismatch that made the dehumidifier itself struggle against a whole room's air in the first place, just running in the opposite direction. It's also worth being honest about when the free layers plus the $9 charcoal genuinely aren't enough on their own, because that's a real scenario for some households, particularly in a genuinely airtight, well-insulated modern home during the most extreme stretch of a humid summer. If your indoor humidity stays persistently high even after consistently applying all 3 free layers, cutting moisture at the source, ventilating in short, complete bursts, and keeping enclosed spaces buffered with charcoal, a mechanical dehumidifier or your air conditioner's dehumidify function still has a legitimate role to play, especially in a sealed modern structure that doesn't have the same natural air exchange a traditional wood and paper building had built into it by design. The difference this whole approach makes isn't necessarily eliminating mechanical dehumidification entirely for every household. It's meaningfully reducing how hard and how constantly that machine has to run, because you've already handled the moisture at its source and given the specific trapped pockets their own dedicated self-renewing fix, instead of asking one machine in the middle of the room to fight all of it at once. That's the real, complete answer to a damp summer house. 3 free habits that handle the majority of the problem, and one $9 item that finishes the specific job those habits can't reach. Together, that's the entire traditional Japanese response to a climate wetter than almost anywhere else on Earth, worked out centuries before anyone could explain the physics behind why it worked, and it still holds up exactly the same way in a modern house today. Before you go, tell me in the comments where the musty smell or the mold actually shows up in your house. Which closet, which corner, which cabinet, and whether it's a spot that's been sealed up and untouched for a while. I read every comment, and those specific trouble spots are usually exactly what shapes the next build on this channel. One last honest note before you go, because it matters for how you actually use this video rather than just watch it. Everything we've covered today addresses condensation-driven dampness and humid, stagnant air, the kind that comes from moisture generated inside your home, or trapped in enclosed spaces, or simply hanging in the air during a genuinely humid season. It does not address rising damp, which shows up at the base of walls regardless of season, often with a visible tide line, or penetrating damp, a localized patch that gets noticeably worse after rain and traces back to something specific outside, a blocked gutter, a cracked seal, a leaking pipe. If what you're dealing with is either of those, no amount of charcoal, ventilation, or laundry habits will fix it, because the water isn't coming from the air in the first place. It's coming from a specific external source that needs to be found and stopped at the source. Watching where water actually goes outside your home during a heavy rain is usually the fastest way to tell the difference, and it costs nothing but 10 minutes and a raincoat. It's also worth saying plainly that persistent, extensive mold, more than a square meter, or growth that keeps coming back across multiple rooms no matter what you try, is worth a professional assessment rather than another round of home remedies, particularly in a household with young children, asthma, allergies, or anyone immunocompromised. That's not a scare tactic. Mold exposure carries genuine respiratory risks past a certain scale, and there's a real point where this stops being a maintenance question and becomes a health one. Everything in today's video is aimed at the ordinary, ongoing dampness most ordinary households deal with every summer. Ordinary enough that a $9 bag of charcoal and a few free habits genuinely solve it, the same way they've been solving it in Japan for roughly 400 years.